Hi, welcome back. I'm Dr. Alex Touchstone, and this is the fourth in a series of time-saving tips for E4D owners and team members. In this particular episode, we're going to focus on preparation design. Now, frankly, whenever I began to prepare for this, I thought about all the various nuances and things that I could discuss, and that could take hours if we were to cover every possible scenario for prep design. So what I decided to do is to focus in on the bread and butter prep that I know absolutely works and that I try to use as much as possible. And so I pulled up a case that I did this week that represents some of the factors or details that I'd like to show you that'll help you to get a very predictable result when it comes to preparation design. So let's take a look at that case. Now you'll see that I've prepped tooth number 4 and tooth number 6, and these are basically modified crown lay preps. The facial surface or buccal surface is completely covered, and this is for aesthetics. This patient needed a shade change, and yet the lingual area is quite a bit supragingival. In addition to that, we've got rounded transitions between any horizontal and vertical surface, and we'll look at this in more detail in just a moment, but you can see this rounded transition between the axial wall and the occlusal reduction. We also have a chamfer margin all the way around, and in fact, these preps were accomplished with only one burr, and that's really important because, the fewer times that I change burrs, the faster my preparation will be. And so the burr that was used for this was a round end tapered burr and a 0.21 millimeter diameter at the tip. I like to use the Premier burrs. I don't know the number for it, but suffice it to say this was a round end tapered burr that accomplished both of these preparations. Now, in a previous webinar, we talked about isolation and how important it is in order to get good scans. Now, just to show you the result here, if we turn on Ice View and we turn off our margin, we can very clearly see our margins, even though we're subgingival down here on the facial of this canine and on the facial of the premolar. A little bit of retraction cord was placed and some Traxident prior to scanning. And so we can see our margins very clearly. So let's jump over into the design view, and we'll focus first on tooth number 4. We'll turn off the Ice View for just a moment. And another thing that I like to do is to try to be conservative whenever possible, and so my goal is to achieve a prep depth, a occlusal reduction depth, of 1 to 1.5 millimeters if I'm using Emax. Now in this case, if we look at this premolar, we'll notice that I'm actually probably a little bit under my goal at 0.5 millimeters down here in the fissures. So let's take a look at what our software does for us whenever we under prep a tooth and the implications of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on my slice plane for just a moment, and we're going to slice through this premolar such that we can see the prep in cross section right about the area where it's thinnest. Now I want you to notice something. We have 2 ways to measure thickness. Actually 3 ways. One is the color coding that we see whenever we turn on this material thickness coding based on this scale over here on the right. The second method is the grid pattern that we see in the slice view itself. Notice that if we look very closely down here at the slice icon, it says 0.5 millimeters. Well, what that means is each of these grid squares is 0.5 millimeters. And so we can see that I'm just a little over 0.5 or about 0.7 or 0.8 right here. In fact, there's a third method. We can turn on this measurement tool and we can click on that area and it will give me a measurement down here in my window, confirming that I'm around 0.8 millimeters in that particular area. Now, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that I'm a little too thin. And because I'm a little too thin, we might have an issue down the road with material longevity. Now, there are a couple of implications here. First, we need to know that the software will overbuild the restoration for me back to 1 millimeter in thickness. So to prove that to you, I'm going to go over here to the mill view, And I'm going to turn on mill sim for just a moment. Well, hang on just a second. Let's blow this up. And we'll look at the occlusal definition again. We can see that I've created an occlusal fissure right here. And it's very clear. And yet we see this warning area that, hey, you're a little thin in this area right here. You're less than 1 millimeter thick. And so if I turn on the mill sim, simulating the milling process itself, and then I look at the restoration as if it had already been milled, we're going to see something interesting happen in this area. I'll blow it up again. Notice the area that was previously in yellow has now been filled in by the software, thus creating a protected zone that is at least 1 millimeter thick. Now, that does two things. Obviously, it obliterates my pretty occlusal anatomy, but the other possible consequence is that if I'm in occlusion right there, guess what? I'm going to be in hyperocclusion clinically. Now, let's just jump back over here to the design view for a second, and let's look at my occlusion. We'll turn that all the way down. There we go. And it turns out that it looks like I'm just outside of this contact down in this deepest area. So in all likelihood, that is not going to affect my occlusion. But the reason I bring that up is if you're seeing instances where you think you've got your occlusion right and yet you're prepping very conservatively, it could be that the software is overbuilding your ceramic for you and it's causing you to have an area of hyperocclusion. So, bottom line is we need to follow those preparation reduction guidelines that are given by the manufacturer of the materials themselves. We need to stay at about 1.5 millimeters, maybe 1 millimeter at a minimum for posterior reduction for restorations that are made out of Emax. And then we need to also round the internal angles and give ourselves a nice chamfer margin or perhaps a shoulder margin. So that's one restoration. If we look over here at number 6, we can see that we've got a couple of features that are very interesting. One is that this happens to be cloned, and so it was a copy of an old restoration. We can see our contact area here. And if we turn on our clone view, we can see that we're very much in line with our clone view, with the exception of this area right here in the cervical, which was intentional. Now notice that this restoration, number 4, has become translucent as a result of highlighting number 6. So we can see our facial or buccal reduction for number 4. If I turn on number 4, we'll see that for number 6 also. We can see our reduction there. And we can see that we've got rounded transitions. Let's go back over here to the margin view so we can see the preparation more clearly. We've got a rounded transition between any horizontal and vertical surfaces. We've got a chamfer margin all the way around. We've created a chamfer back here on the lingual. We've stayed supergingival whenever possible. Could have stayed supergingival in the facial if there wasn't a need for any significant shade change. So there you go. Those are my bread and butter go-to restorations or preparations for creating Emax restorations for both the posterior and the anterior. Again, one burr, just a round-end tapered burr, go around, get the reduction that you need, and you're ready to go. Now, as I mentioned to you before, there's a lot of things to talk about with regard to preparation design. So I'm going to revisit this concept in a future webinar. I'm going to show you a clinical example of some inlay onlays and some other crown lay styles and so forth. And so I hope that you'll return for that information. And I certainly hope that this information has been helpful to you, with the ultimate goal of giving you restorations that fit perfectly in a minimum amount of time. Thank you.